Hey everyone, this is Mike. Today we're going to be talking about Warrior in Shadowbringers. Now this is a job that is probably the one that I've played the most over my time playing 14, because tank is the role that I enjoy playing the most. Back in Stormblood is where I played tank the most as well, but Warrior was really the only tank that I enjoyed in that expansion. And now going into Shadowbringers, Warrior pretty much only really got better. Even though they've made it a little bit simpler to play now, there are also other things that made it a little bit harder when it comes down to optimizing your DPS. Now when it comes down to just playing Warrior, it's a very straightforward job. It is probably one of the best tanks to pick up if you're looking to get into the tank role itself, because Warrior itself is just very simple. The only thing you're really going to be doing is managing your beast gauge as well as your Storm's Eye damage buff, and that is pretty much it. You don't have that many off-global cooldowns when it comes down to your rotation. Most of your off-global cooldowns are going to be for defensive stuff, which is all about like you playing as a tank, and that means that you have a lot of other time to just focus on the fight that you're doing, making sure the boss is positioned correctly. If you see an incoming tank buster, you're going to have those off-global cooldown spaces to just reactively use cooldowns as well, rather than if I were to look at something like a Gunbreaker that is using a lot of off-global cooldowns for their damage rotation, might be struggling a little bit more to reacting to new mechanics that you're seeing for the first time when you pick up a tank. Because of course, if you've always played DPS, you don't know where all the tank busters are going to be in a specific fight, so you're most often than not going to be reacting to them rather than preventively using your cooldowns already in anticipation of the tank buster that is coming like 5 or 10 seconds later, because of course you can do that with long lasting defensive buffs. But of course, if you're playing something like a Gunbreaker, you're already double weaving a lot of stuff for your DPS kit. You might not have the places to use those defensive cooldowns when it comes down to you playing as a tank, and because your Warrior doesn't really have that many off-global cooldowns to use for their damage rotation, it makes it very easy to react to new mechanics or to tank busters that you didn't know were going to be coming. Now, Warrior itself in the tank role, I feel like it's kind of like the healing tank. I made a video on this a while back, the healing power of Warrior. If you want to go check it out, that is the name. But Warrior is incredibly strong when it comes down to healing, especially when both of your tanks are going to be tanking bosses, which is why I'm also using Alexander Ultimate as a backdrop for this, because in this fight I was able to heal myself as well as my co-tank quite a bit by making use of my healing tools. Now, because of these healing tools, Warrior is also usually best put as the main tank, because two of your healing tools are only really accessible when you're taking damage. You have one of them that can also help heal your co-tank, but the other two are going to be personal healing tools. So you do want to be the one that is taking the damage, and because Warrior doesn't have that many off-global cooldowns, repositioning the boss and that kind of stuff also becomes really easy, which is why I feel like Warrior, if I were to look at all of the other tanks, is definitely the best main tank rather than an off tank, which is why I feel like if you have a Warrior in the party, they should always be the one tanking the boss. Now, of course, this healing is pretty strong when it comes down to just doing your 8-man content where you're fighting a single boss, but when it comes down to dungeons, that is where this healing power becomes completely ridiculous, especially if you're able to pair it up with some of your very hard-hitting moves, because Warrior during its normal rotation doesn't do a crazy amount of damage, but it does have a few abilities that do a crazy amount of damage in a very short burst window, and if you're able to pair these abilities together with your healing stuff, you're actually going to be able to heal a lot from being able to hit those abilities, because one of your healing tools is kind of like a lifesteal effect that you get for a few seconds. So let's talk about the defensive kit first, then we'll talk about the healing stuff that we have available to us, and then I'll just go into everything else that you need to know about Warrior. So first of all, as with all the other tanks, we have Rampart, 20% mitigation, pretty straightforward. Vengeance is our equivalent of the 30% mitigation. Now, the cool thing about Warrior is that Vengeance also has a retaliation effect on it. So as long as Vengeance is active, every time that you get hit by something, can be a tank buster, can be just an auto attack, you will actually deal some damage back to that mob that is hitting you, or the boss that is hitting you, which makes it actually really strong in dungeons, because you're just going to be using it. You take 30% less damage from like these 10 mobs that are hitting you, but every time they hit you, they're also going to be taking damage back. This also works together with your inner release. Inner release is something that makes it so that all of the next GCDs and other abilities that you're going to be using are going to do crit direct hit damage, but we'll talk about inner release itself later, because there are some other things attached to it. But basically, this retaliation effect from Vengeance will also become a crit direct hit. It's not much damage, but it is something, and it's really fun to see as well. It's pretty unique to Warrior, because it's the only tank that has something like that on their 30% mitigation. Then Raw Intuition is basically your spammable cooldown. It's on a very short cooldown, does some mitigation, but it also shares a recast timer with one of our healing tools that I'll be talking about in just a second. And more often than not, you're gonna want to use the healing portion instead of the Raw Intuition, because more often than not, you're gonna be able to survive the damage by using another cooldown. Raw Intuition isn't really something that you're gonna be using on its own. You're usually going to pair it up with, for example, a Thrill of Battle, a Rampart, a Vengeance, and then use Raw Intuition on top of that. And more often than not, you're gonna be able to survive with just the other cooldowns, and then you can use Nascent Flesh, which is the healing ability, to heal yourself back up. Of course, if you don't have all of these cooldowns up because you died, or for example you had to take a tank buster that was meant for another tank because they were dead or something like that. If you don't know if you'll survive, of course just use Raw Intuition. It's better for you to survive and your healers to heal you up later, rather than to die to a tank buster that you were planning to heal up a little bit yourself after the fact. So still pretty good to use if you're not sure you're going to survive. Homegang is our ultimate cooldown. This is a really great one because it's on a very short cooldown compared to all of the other tanks. Lasts about 8 seconds I believe now, because they buffed the duration of it. And what it does, it basically makes it so that you can't drop below 1 HP. So once this duration runs out, your healers do need to make sure to heal you up so that you don't die to the next auto attack. But it's still a pretty good cooldown to use. It's especially useful because of its shorter cooldown, making it so that you can use it twice or maybe even 3 times in a fight, whereas the other tanks usually only can use their ultimate cooldown once or twice in a fight. Warrior can usually get that extra use out of it, which is what makes it so good, because you can use it to cheese extra stuff. And then we have Shake It Off. This is our party wide mitigation. This one is a shield that you can actually make stronger as well. The cool thing about this is that it will literally shake off all of your defensive buffs that you have on you. Not Rampart though. But Thrill of Battle, Vengeance and Raw Intuition can all be shaken off, and for each defensive buff that you shake off, you basically make your shield a whole lot stronger. Usually that's not really needed, but most of the time you'll be able to use Raw Intuition right before you use that Shake It Off to make it stronger. There are also certain fights where you will be taking a Tank Buster into a raid-wide damaging ability, so you can use your defensive cooldowns for the Tank Buster, and then you shake off the cooldowns to basically give yourself and your party also a much bigger shield when it comes down to the raid-wide that is following that. So a really cool skill indeed. Now we also have some healing cooldowns. Of course these are still defensive cooldowns because they're gonna be helping you in some way, and some will also make you a lot tougher to kill. So first of all we have Thrill of Battle. This is kind of like a healing cooldown, but it's also a normal defensive cooldown, because what it does is it will increase your maximum HP by 20%. So it doesn't reduce the damage you take by 20%, it just gives you a bigger HP pool in order to take that damage. Now the cool thing here is that it will also immediately heal you for that 20% extra HP that you just got. And then once Thrill of Battle runs out and your maximum HP decreases by 20% again, you won't lose 20% HP. As long as you're, let's say for example, you have 100,000 HP. You use Thrill of Battle, you get 120,000 HP. Now you take a Tank Buster of 20k, so you're dropped back to 100,000. Then Thrill of Battle's effect runs out, then you're still going to be stuck at that 100,000 HP. So you don't lose the HP that was given by Thrill of Battle, which is really nice. Now on top of that, you're also granted a 20% healing buff on all of the healing that comes in on you. This will work together with all of the healing stuff from the healers, but also with your own personal healing cooldowns as well, which is incredibly cool. Secondly, we have Equilibrium. This is a very simple button, press it, you gain an instant heal. This can crit, so you can actually gain quite a lot of HP from this, especially when it's paired up together with something like Thrill of Battle. And then last but not least, we have Nascent Flash. This is our lifesteal effect that I was talking about earlier. Basically, you put it on, it can last for about 3 GCDs if you use it towards the end of your off-global cooldown timer. And you want to try to pair this up with some very strong abilities, like for example Fell Cleave, Inner Chaos. I'll talk about those abilities in a second, but those hit very hard. And of course, if you're in a dungeon, you can pretty much just spam these every 25 seconds to make sure that you basically heal up a bunch. And then if you pair it up with some of your strong AoE abilities, the healer basically won't even have to pay attention to you, which is what I think is so much fun about Warrior. Then moving over to our combos. Warrior is fairly simple, they only have 2 different combos. The start of your combo is going to be the same as well. It's always going to be a heavy swing into a maim, and then the third part of your combo is going to be up to you what you want to choose. We have Storm's Eye, which will grant you a damage buff that lasts 30 seconds. It can stack up all the way to 60 seconds, so every time you use Storm's Eye, you're basically going to be giving 30 seconds of this damage buff. And then we have Storm's Path, which will basically heal you a little bit, but will also generate more Beast Gauge. Now, I talked about how Beast Gauge is something that you're going to be managing as Warrior. This is a very important aspect to Warrior as well, because all of your off-global cooldowns and most of your strong abilities are also going to be attached to this Beast Gauge, so it's definitely a very important thing to manage. Now, basically how this works is your maim, the second part in your combo, will grant you 10 Beast Gauge, and then Storm's Eye will grant you 10 as well. Storm's Path will grant you 20. So what you want to be doing is, whenever Storm's Eye needs to be refreshed, you're going to be using that, but then you get less Beast Gauge, and then in between each of those Storm's Eye refreshes, you're going to be using Storm's Path until Storm's Eye needs to be refreshed again. So fairly straightforward over there. You just hit 1, 2, look at your Storm's Eye buff. Oh, it's low, use Storm's Eye. Oh, it's pretty high, use Storm's Path, generate some extra Beast Gauge right there. Pretty straightforward. And then of course, last but not least, we need to talk about the Beast Gauge. This is the big mechanic behind Warrior, where we pretty much have all of the cool abilities. So let's talk about it. Well, first of all, we have two GCDs that are attached to this. We have the Fell Cleave, which is a single target ability. We have Decimate, which is an AoE ability. And both of these can also be upgraded by using Infuriate. Whenever you use Infuriate, you gain 50 Beast Gauge, which we need 50 Beast Gauge for the Fell Cleave and the Decimate. But when you use Infuriate, you're also granted the Nascent Chaos buff. Now, whilst this buff is active, your Fell Cleave and your Decimate will be upgraded in a stronger version, more potency, but they will also do guaranteed direct hit crits, and they're called Chaotic Cyclone for AoE and Inner Chaos for your single target. Now, of course, once you have that buff, you use your Inner Chaos, the buff is gone, so you need to use Infuriate again, but this is something that you want to be pairing up with that Nascent Flash, with that healing ability, the Lifesteal one, when you're going into dungeons, when you're going into a Savage fight, because that way you can be like, okay, I have 2 Infuriate charges ready, I'm gonna be taking a Tank Buster. You take the Tank Buster, you throw on Nascent Flash, you use 2 Inner Chaoses, and all of a sudden you're back to half HP or something like that. So definitely very strong if you pair them up together with your Nascent Flash, for example in a dungeon as well. You're almost dead, Nascent Flash, Chaotic Cyclone, and all of a sudden you're back to full HP because you just hit, like, let's say 10 different mobs with a very high potency crit direct hit AoE ability, so definitely really strong to pair up with that. We also still have 2 off-global cooldowns that are attached to our Beast Gauge, which are Upheaval and Onslaught. Upheaval, very simple, it is the best gauge to damage spender that we have. It only costs 20 Beast Gauge, and it does a pretty decent amount of damage, and it's also an off-global cooldown, so definitely your highest priority on the list of what you want to spend your Beast Gauge on. And then we also have Onslaught. This is our gap closer, but unlike the other tanks, this does not have a stacking cooldown. Like all of the other tanks basically have a cooldown, or like their gap closer, on a 2 charge cooldown, so they can basically stack it up to 2 charges. And they also want to be using it for damage purposes, whereas Onslaught for Warrior is a damage loss. You can still use it if you want to try to fix your Beast Gauge if it's wrong, even though with the latest change to Warrior, this isn't necessarily the case anymore. So for the most part, you're only going to be using Onslaught if you really need it for the gap closer. Outside of that, you try to use this as least as possible, because it's a damage loss compared to everything else that you can do with your Beast Gauge. And then we of course have to talk about Inner Release. This is a very strong ability. This is the biggest burst window that Warrior has available to itself as well, because once Inner Release is active, you gain 2 things. First of all of your abilities, both GCDs and off-global cooldowns, are going to direct hit crit, and on top of that, all of your Beast Gauge actions are going to cost 0 Beast Gauge. So you basically want to be spamming all of your Beast Gauge actions whilst Inner Release is active. Now, also very important to note is that you do not want to have the Nascent Chaos buff active whilst you go into your Inner Release, because Nascent Chaos makes it so that your next Fell Cleave or Decimate is going to do direct hit crit damage in the upgraded version of Chaotic Cyclone and Inner Chaos. But that's basically going to be the same as your Inner Release as well, because Inner Release also guarantees the direct hit crit stuff, so that is why you don't want to pair these up together. When you go into into in release, make sure you've consumed the Nascent Chaos buff, and also make sure that you're not going to be overcapping your Infuriate, because every time that you use a Decimate or a Fell Cleave, or Inner Chaos and Chaotic Cyclone, your Infuriate is going to go down by 5 seconds on the cooldown, so that's something that you have to pay attention to as well. Make sure the Nascent Chaos buff has been consumed, make sure you're not going to be overcapping your Infuriate charges by basically using 5 Fell Cleaves in a row. During in release, we also want to be using our Onslaught, of course, because it is free, so that's basically just going to be the major use of where you're going to be using those Onslaughts as well. And that is pretty much Warrior. It's a fairly simple and straightforward tank to play. I know it might sound a little bit confusing with the Beast Gauge, the upgrading of the Fell Cleave and the Decimate, but once you play it, you'll actually see that there's not all that much to it, which is why I think that Warrior is the perfect tank if you want to get into tanking. It's also very self-sustainable with Equilibrium, Thrill of Battle and Nascent Flash. If you're using those cooldowns correctly and you have a bad healer in the party, you'll be able to keep yourself alive without having to rely too much on them. It is also just incredibly fun when I can go into a dungeon with a friend of mine, for example, that is playing healer, and I can just be like, nah, you can just do as much damage as you want, I'll keep myself alive. That is something that I find very rewarding for myself as well. And then, for example, when I went in the Alexander Ultimate, I started as Gunbreaker, I switched to Warrior because I saw that my healers were having some trouble keeping me alive, and then I just basically made their life a whole lot easier. That way they could focus on healing the rest of the party a little bit more as well, or focus more on the mechanics, basically to take a little bit of their load. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. So Warrior, pretty fun job to play, probably my most played job in the game at the moment, and it will probably stay like that for a while as long as they don't change Warrior all that much going into the next expansion. So let me know what you think of Warrior. If you have any more questions, feel free to leave them in the comments down below as well. But I want to thank you for watching, I want to thank my patrons for supporting me, and I'll see you in the next one.